The Montana wind carries no mercy. It slices through flesh and freezes blood. But on that day, it also carried the whispers of betrayal. A stagecoach, a symbol of progress and hope, became a rolling coffin its passengers sacrificed for a secret buried in a leather-bound book. They left her for dead, a society woman from Philadelphia bleeding out in the snow. But they made one mistake. They didn't see the other survivor watching from the pines, a man with no name and a past forged in silence. What follows is not just a story of survival against the odds, but a testament to the fact that in the harshest wilderness, sometimes the deepest wounds aren't from a bullet, but from the ghosts we carry. The world outside the Concord stagecoach was a blur of unrelenting white and skeletal grey. Isabel Laurent clutching the reticule on her lap until her knuckles were as pale as the snow-choked landscape had long since given up trying to find beauty in the Montana Territory. For 3 days, the journey from Corinne Station had been a relentless assault on body and spirit. The iron-shod wheels screamed against the frozen ruts of the trail, a sound that seemed to mimic the protest in her own bones. Inside the coach, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, stale whiskey, and the cloying sweetness of the perfume worn by the woman opposite Penelope Davies. Miss Davies, a woman whose best years were a decade behind her, but refused to acknowledge their departure, was currently napping her head, lolling against the worn leather squabs with an unladylike snore. Beside Isabel, the Reverend Michael Evans read from his Bible, his lips moving silently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Or perhaps Isabel suspected in silent prayer for their deliverance from this wretched conveyance. He was a thin, bird-like man, whose piety seemed to offer him little protection from the relentless jolts that sent him airborne every few minutes. The final passenger, a gambler named Sterling Hayes, was the only one who seemed at ease. Dressed in a brocade vest and a tailored coat that was wholly unsuitable for the climate, he idly shuffled a deck of worn playing cards. The soft, rhythmic riffle was the only sound that challenged the cacophony of the trail. His eyes, sharp and calculating, occasionally flickered towards Isabel. He'd tried to engage her in conversation earlier, his words slick with an assumed charm she'd learned to recognize and deflect in the drawing rooms of Philadelphia. Here in the heart of nowhere, it felt more predatory. Not much farther to Blackwood Gulch, Hayes commented, his voice smooth as polished stone. "They say fortunes are being made and lost." He fanned the cards, a perfect river of kings and queens. "A lady of your refinement must have important business there." Isabel offered a tight, dismissive smile. "I am to take up a position as a governess, Mr. Hayes, for the children of a Mr. Hinault, Alistair Finch." The lie felt clumsy on her tongue, but it was the story she had been instructed to tell. The truth was far more complex and far more dangerous, sealed within the false bottom of the very book she held in her lap. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Inside it was not the reflections of a Roman emperor, but sensitive federal survey maps and deposition transcripts detailing railroad corruption entrusted to her by her late father. A U.S. senator who had made powerful enemies before his sudden convenient heart failure. Her destination was not a governor's post, but a clandestine meeting with a trusted federal marshal, Patrick O'Connell, the one man her father believed could expose the rot. A noble calling. The Reverend Evans interjected, looking up from his scripture to shape the minds of the young in this godless land. Before Hayes could offer another platitude, the coach gave a violent lurch, followed by a sickening crunch of splintering wood. Isabel was thrown hard against the Reverend, and Miss Davies awoke with a startled shriek. The coach tilted precariously, scraping along the ground for a few agonizing feet before shuddering to a violent angled halt. Outside the driver, a burly man named Amos Whitaker roared a curse. "Whoa, whoa, damn you!" A gunshot answered him, sharp, final. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Sterling Hayes's face had lost its cavalier confidence, replaced by a chalky mask of fear. He slowly tucked his cards back into his coat. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Heavy, crunching footsteps approached through the snow. The door on the high side of the coach was wrenched open, framing the silhouette of a massive man in a thick buffalo coat against the glaring white sky. His face was obscured by a thick dark beard and the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but the long-barreled Colt peacemaker in his hand was perfectly terrifyingly clear. "Evening, folks," the man rasped, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Apologies for the rough stop. Now be so kind as to toss out your valuables. Wallets, watches, jewelry, and the mail sack." More figures appeared, their faces covered with bandanas. There were at least 5 of them. They moved with a practiced, brutal efficiency. The Reverend began to pray aloud, a trembling plea to the Almighty. "Quiet, preacher," another outlaw snarled, yanking the mail sack from the boot. Hayes, his hands raised, spoke carefully. "Take what you want. There's no need for anyone else to get hurt." The leader, the big man in the buffalo coat, let his gaze drift over the passengers. It was a cold, appraising look, like a butcher selecting a cut of meat. His eyes lingered on Miss Davies's pearl necklace, then on the gambler's ornate watch chain. But then they settled on Isabel. Or rather, on the book she was clutching to her chest. And the lady the leader said, his voice dropping, "You'll hand over that book." A cold spike of pure terror pierced Isabel's heart. It wasn't a random robbery. They knew. But how? How could they possibly know? Panic warred with the ingrained instinct to protect her father's legacy. It's just a book of philosophy," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "It has sentimental value." The leader chuckled, a low, guttural sound that held no humor. "I'm sure it does. Hand it over, ma'am. Now." He gestured with the Colt, the black eye of the barrel an undeniable abyss. Isabel's mind raced. Her father's warnings, the secrecy, the long journey, it was all for this. To fail now was to let him die in vain. She hugged the book tighter. "No." The word, small and defiant, hung in the frigid air. The leader's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, reaching into the coach. Sterling Hayes, in a shocking suicidal act of gallantry or desperation, suddenly lunged not at the leader, but at the outlaw closest to him, trying to knock his gun aside. The world erupted in chaos. A deafening blast filled the door, filled the small space. Hayes grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face as a dark stain blossomed on his brocade vest. He crumpled to the floor of the coach without a sound. Miss Davies screamed, a high, piercing shriek that was cut short by a vicious backhand from another of the bandits. The Reverend cowered, his prayers turning into choked sobs. In that split second of bloody confusion, Isabel acted on pure instinct. She shoved the heavy book down the side of her seat, wedging it deep between the cushion and the wooden frame of the coach. The leader, his face a mask of fury at Hayes's interruption, turned his attention back to her. His eyes were no longer cold. They were burning with rage. He saw her movement, saw her empty hands. "Where is it?" he roared, grabbing the front of her traveling coat and hauling her halfway out of the coach. The book. Where is it? I don't know what you're talking about, she cried, the lie tasting like ash. His fist, large and calloused, slammed into her side, driving the air from her lungs. She gasped, pain exploding behind her ribs. He threw her back against the seat, his foul breath hot on her face. His men were ransacking the coach now, tearing at the upholstery, throwing luggage out into the snow. "Find it!" the leader bellowed. "Tear this thing apart!" Isabel huddled in the corner, her body screaming in protest, her mind numb with shock and terror. She watched as they ripped and tore, their frustration mounting. They found nothing. The false bottom of the book was one thing. The tight crevice of the coach seat was another, a hiding place born of sheer desperate luck. The leader turned back to her, his face contorted into a snarl of pure malice. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons, and dragged her bodily from the coach. He threw her to the ground, the impact jarring her teeth. The frozen earth was brutally hard, the cold seeping instantly through her layers of clothing. "Last chance, lady," he spat, looming over her. "My employer is a man of particular tastes. He wants what you're carrying. He doesn't care how he gets it." The mention of an employer sent another shock wave of fear through her. This was bigger than a simple band of outlaws. "I have nothing," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. He stared down at her for a long moment, his chest heaving. The frustration of his men was palpable. They had killed 2 people and had nothing to show for it but a few trinkets. He seemed to come to a decision. A waste, he muttered more to himself than to her. He raised his Colt peacemaker, the hammer clicking back with a sound of utter finality. Isabel squeezed her eyes shut, a prayer to a god she wasn't sure she believed in forming on her lips. She thought of her father, of his proud, sad face, the last time she saw him. "Be brave, Isabel. Be smart." The blast was deafening. An anvil of force slammed into her shoulder, a searing, white-hot agony that eclipsed all thought, all feeling. She was thrown backward, her head hitting the frozen ground with a sickening crack. Her last conscious sensation was the sight of the outlaws mounting their horses, the leader giving one last frustrated look at the wrecked stagecoach before wheeling his horse around and disappearing into the swirling snow. Then there was only the cold and a vast encroaching darkness that promised to swallow her whole. The first thing to pierce the veil of blackness was pain. It was not the sharp, explosive pain of the gunshot, but a deep, throbbing, incandescent fire that had taken root in her shoulder and spread its tendrils through every inch of her body. The second was the cold. It was a physical presence, a monstrous entity that pressed down on her, leaching the very memory of warmth from her bones. Isabel's eyes fluttered open to a world of grey. The sky was a leaden sheet, the snow-covered ground an endless expanse of pale ash. The stagecoach lay on its side like a dead beast, its door agape. The bodies of Amos Whitaker and Sterling Hayes were dark, still shapes against the white, already dusted with a fine layer of new snow. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over her. They had left her, left for dead. A faint rhythmic sound reached her ears. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and close. Terror, stark and primal, surged through her. They had come back. They had realized their mistake, realized she might have survived, and they had come back to finish the job. She tried to move, to crawl, to hide, but her body was a leaden weight unresponsive to her will. The effort sent a fresh wave of agony through her shoulder, and a low moan escaped her lips. The footsteps stopped. She forced her head to turn a movement that cost her dearly. A figure stood beside the coach, not 20 feet away. He was not one of the outlaws. He was tall and lean-clad in buckskins and furs that blended with the muted tones of the winter landscape. A plains rifle was held loosely in one hand. His face was stark and angular, framed by long, straight black hair that fell past his shoulders. His skin was the color of weathered copper, his eyes dark and deep-set. He wore no expression she could name. It was not kindness, not cruelty, just a profound and unsettling stillness. He was watching her. His gaze was intense, missing nothing. He saw the slow rise and fall of her chest, the tremble in her limbs, the dark, frozen stain of blood that had blossomed across her dress and coat from her shoulder. For a long moment, he did not move. He was like a wolf, wary and assessing, deciding if the creature before him was a threat or prey, or something to be ignored entirely. Isabel's heart hammered against her ribs. Who was he? A trapper? A bounty hunter? Another scavenger drawn by the scent of death? Her life, fragile as a shard of ice, was in his hands. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned his rifle against the overturned wheel of the coach. He moved towards her, his steps making almost no sound in the soft snow. He knelt beside her. His proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of pine smoke, leather, and the sharp, clean scent of the cold itself. He reached out a gloved hand, not toward her, but toward the wound. He stopped his fingers hovering just inches from the torn, blood-caked fabric. His eyes met hers. In their dark depths, she saw not malice, but an unnerving, analytical intelligence. It was the look of a man who understood wounds, who understood the brutal calculus of survival. He made a gesture with his hand, a slight questioning tilt. May I, Isabel, could only give a faint, almost imperceptible nod. The pain was a rising tide threatening to drag her under again. He took that as consent. With a surprising gentleness, his fingers explored the edges of the wound, his touch firm but careful. He was assessing the damage. She flinched, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as a fresh spike of pain shot through her. He immediately withdrew his hand. He rose to his feet and walked back to the stagecoach. She watched her vision blurring as he effortlessly pulled himself up onto the tilted frame. He disappeared inside for a moment, and she heard the sound of shifting objects. He reappeared with a thick wool blanket, one of the travel blankets from the coach, and the Reverend's small, discarded satchel. He dropped them to the ground, and then, with the same fluid grace, swung himself down. He unfolded the blanket, and with careful, efficient movements began to tuck it around her. He was methodical, ensuring every part of her was covered, fighting back the insidious cold that was her most immediate enemy. Then he opened the Reverend's satchel. Inside were a few personal effects, the Bible and a small metal flask. He opened the flask, sniffed it, and a flicker of something disapproval perhaps crossed his features. Whiskey. He stoppered it and put it back. He was looking for something else. His search yielded a small roll of clean linen bandages, likely intended for minor scrapes, not gunshot wounds. It was better than nothing. Without a word, he took his hunting knife from its sheath. The blade was long and wickedly sharp, glinting dully in the grey light. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Isabel again. But he did not turn the blade on her. He moved to a nearby stand of young aspens. He cut several straight, sturdy branches, stripping them of their smaller twigs with swift economic motions. In a matter of minutes, he had the basic components of a travois. He lashed them together with rawhide thongs he produced from a pouch on his belt. All his movements were infused with a powerful, silent purpose. He did not speak, grunt, or make any sound. He worked with an unwavering focus that was both mesmerizing and frightening. He was a creature of this wilderness, as much a part of it as the snow and the trees. Once the travois was constructed, he returned Tomtu to her side. He looked down at her, then at the crude sled he had built. The unspoken question was clear. He intended to move her. The thought of being lifted, of her shattered shoulder being jostled, was terrifying. But the alternative was to lie here and freeze to death. He knelt again, his dark eyes holding hers. He made a series of small, precise movements with his hands. A point to her, a scooping motion, a point to the travois. It was a language without sound, a message of intent. I will lift you. I will place you there. He then held up one hand, palm out. Be still. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her back, the other under her knees. He was astonishingly strong. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than a child. His movements calculated to cause the least possible disturbance to her injured shoulder. Still a cry of agony was torn from her throat as the fire inside her erupted anew. Her vision swam with black spots. Through the haze of pain, she was aware of being gently lowered onto the blanket-padded travois, of him securing her with more rawhide, ensuring she would not slip off. He picked up the rifle, slung it over his back, and took the two ends of the travois poles in his hands. He leaned forward, taking the strain. And then they were moving. The journey was a surreal nightmare. Isabel drifted in and out of consciousness, her world a nauseating sway of grey sky and white ground. The only constant was the silent figure in front of her, his back a bulwark against the wind, his steady, rhythmic pace a testament to an impossible endurance. He did not falter, did not slow. He simply walked, pulling her away from the sight of her own death. At some point, the flat expanse of snow began to change. The ground became unnervingly smooth, the grey light reflecting off its surface with a slick, glassy sheen. Ice. They had reached a frozen lake, or perhaps a vast, flat plain that had flooded and frozen over. The ice flats. The name came to her from a snippet of conversation she'd overheard from the driver, Amos. God willing, we get across the flats before the next blizzard. Nothing out there but wind and death. The wind, which had been a constant moan, now rose to a piercing shriek. It swept across the open ice, unimpeded by trees or hills, carrying with it a cold so profound it felt like a physical blow. It tore at the blanket, seeking out any gap, any weakness. Snow hard and granular, like sand, flew with it, stinging any exposed skin. Her savior, for what else could she call him, lowered his head against the onslaught and kept walking. He was a lone, dark figure against a universe of white, pulling his fragile cargo across a sea of ice. He was her anchor in a world that had dissolved into pain and chaos. He was silent. He was strong. And he was her only hope. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the darkness her last coherent thought. A prayer that this silent, mysterious man was not simply dragging her to a more secluded place to die. Time dissolved into a fevered dream, a disjointed tapestry of pain, cold, and the relentless rhythmic crunch of boots on snow and ice. Isabel was a passenger in her own body, a helpless observer of her own suffering. She was vaguely aware of stopping of the silent man, forcing a few drops of melted snow and later a bitter hot broth between her lips. He would check her bonds, adjust her blankets, his movements always efficient, always devoid of wasted motion. His face, when she could focus on it, remained a stony mask, but his eyes held a watchful intensity. He was fighting for her life with a grim determination that she lacked the strength to muster for herself. The landscape of the ice flats eventually gave way to the jagged teeth of foothills dark with pine and rock. The going became harder. Isabel felt every jolt, every rock and dip in the trail as a fresh agony in her shoulder. Her savior never slowed. His endurance was supernatural inhuman. He navigated the treacherous terrain as if born to it, his lean frame a study in resilience. She awoke from a particularly deep lapse into delirium to find they were no longer moving. The biting wind was gone, replaced by a still heavy silence. She was indoors. A low roof of rough-hewn logs was visible above her. A fire crackled softly in a stone hearth nearby, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the log walls. The warmth was the most exquisite sensation she had ever known. A gentle tide pushing back the deep, consuming cold. She was lying on a crude cot, a bed of pine boughs covered with furs that smelled of dust and wild things. Her wet, blood-soaked coat and the upper part of her dress had been cut away. The wound in her shoulder was clean, the area around it covered with a dark, pungent poultice of mashed leaves and herbs. A clean, if rough, strip of linen held it in place. He was there, sitting on a low stool by the fire, his back to her. He was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the soft shh of steel on stone, a soothing domestic sound in the small cabin. The place was a trapper's line shack, long abandoned by the looks of it. It was tiny, just one room, but it was shelter. It was life. "Hello." Her voice was a dry, cracked whisper. It sounded foreign in her own ears. The sound of the knife stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He remained perfectly still, as if listening not just to her voice, but to the very air around it. Then slowly he rose and faced her. In the warm firelight, she could see him more clearly than before. His face was etched with lines that spoke of hardship and a deep, abiding sorrow. There were old scars on his knuckles, and a faint, silvery line that traced its way from his temple into his hairline. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps no more than 30, but he possessed the ancient eyes of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. He walked over to the cot and knelt, his gaze going to her wound, then to her face. He reached out and gently placed the back of his hand against her forehead, checking for fever. His touch was surprisingly soft, the calluses on his hand scraping gently against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered the words, inadequate, absurdly small for the debt she owed. "You saved me." He gave a slow, single nod. It was an acknowledgement, not an acceptance of thanks. He moved back to the fire and returned with a tin cup of warm water, which he held to her lips. She drank greedily, the simple liquid a balm to her parched throat. Days bled into one another in the quiet solitude of the cabin. He was a tireless caretaker. He would leave for hours at a time, disappearing silently into the wilderness, always returning with something: a rabbit, a brace of grouse, or fresh herbs for her poultice. He was a ghost in the woods, a master of his domain. He would cook the meat in a small battered pot he'd found in the cabin, making a simple, nourishing broth that he fed to her. He never spoke, not a single word. His silence was a palpable entity in the small cabin. It was not an empty silence, but one freighted with history, with pain. Isabel, a woman accustomed to the constant chatter of society, to witty repartee and learned discussion, found it both unnerving and strangely comforting. There were no lies in his silence, no false platitudes. There was only the truth of action. He was saving her life. That was his language. Her strength began to return in small increments. Soon she could sit up on her own, the fire in her shoulder dulling to a persistent, manageable ache. She watched him studying his every move, trying to piece together the puzzle of the man she had named in her own mind, Caelan. It was a name she'd read once, Gaelic for slender warrior, and it seemed to fit his lean, powerful grace. One afternoon, while he was out hunting, a wave of restlessness and curiosity propelled her from the cot. Leaning against the wall for support, she took a few shaky steps. Her eyes fell upon his bedroll, a simple bundle of furs in the corner. Tucked partly beneath it was a small, worn leather pouch. Her sense of propriety warred with a desperate need to understand the man who held her life in his hands. Curiosity won. Her fingers trembling slightly, she opened the drawstring. Inside were not coins or trinkets, but a handful of objects. The first was a tarnished silver locket. She clicked it open. On one side was a faded daguerreotype of a smiling young woman with dark hair and kind eyes. On the other was a tiny, exquisitely carved wooden bird, no bigger than her thumbnail. The second object was a U.S. Army corporal's insignia, the two chevrons frayed and stained. And the last thing was a folded, yellowed piece of paper, a wanted poster. With a jolt, she recognized the crudely sketched face. It was the outlaw leader from the Stagecoach, the man in the buffalo coat. The name printed below the sketch was Bartholomew Black Bart Thorne, wanted for robbery, murder, and crimes against the railroad in the Dakota Territory. The reward was $500. Suddenly, his presence at the massacre site was no longer a coincidence. He hadn't stumbled upon the wreck. He was hunting. He was tracking Bartholomew Thorne. His silence, his grim focus, his skill. They were the tools of a man on a mission, a bounty hunter, or something more personal. The locket suggested a deeper, more tragic motive. She carefully put the items back in the pouch and pushed it back under his bedroll, her heart pounding. She had just touched the raw, exposed nerve of his past. When he returned at dusk, a brace of snowshoe hares slung over his shoulder, she saw him differently. She saw the ghost of the woman in the locket, reflected in his sorrowful eyes. She saw the discipline of the soldier in the way he carried himself. She saw the relentless predator in the set of his jaw as he glanced for just a moment at the worn pouch in the corner, his eyes telling her that he knew she had looked. He didn't seem angry, merely resigned. It was a truth between them now, another unspoken thing. That evening, as she sat propped up on her cot, she decided to risk sharing her own truth. They weren't just robbing the stagecoach. She said, her voice quiet but clear in the small space. He was cleaning his rifle by the fire, his movements precise. He didn't stop, but she knew he was listening. They were after something I was carrying. They knew I had it. She paused, watching his back. My father was Senator William Laurent. He was investigating a man named Harrison Croft, the president of the Union Pacific Western Expansion. He believed Croft was using men like Thorne to clear settlers and native tribes off land, The railroad wanted using fraudulent claims and violence. The maps and documents proving it were with me. Hidden. She finally said the words that had been haunting her. I think Harrison Croft had my father killed, and I think he hired Thorne to kill me and retrieve that evidence. At the mention of Thorne's name, his hands stilled. For a long moment, he did not. The only sound was the crackle and pop of the fire. Then slowly, he set down the rifle and turned to face her. His expression was no longer emotive. It was a raw, stark landscape of grief and rage, so powerful it was like a physical blow. He reached into his own shirt and pulled out a leather cord from around his neck. On it was another small carved wooden bird, identical to the one in the locket. He held it out on his palm for her to see. He still did not speak, but in that moment, his silence screamed. It spoke of a shared enemy, of a parallel tragedy. The woman in the locket, the wife or sister or lover he had lost, was almost certainly another of Thorne's victims, another casualty of Harrison Croft's relentless ambition. Isabel looked from the bird in his hand to his tormented face. Their separate paths of survival and vengeance had converged in this tiny, isolated cabin. They were bound together now, not just by her rescue, but by a common blood-soaked purpose. The journey to Blackwood Gulch was no longer just about her survival or delivering a message. It was about a reckoning. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this silent, haunted man would not stop until Bartholomew Thorne was in the ground. The journey to Blackwood Gulch took another 4 days after they left the cabin. Kaelin, as she now firmly called him in her mind, had decided she was strong enough to ride. He had found a pair of old snowshoes in the cabin for himself and had fashioned a makeshift saddle for the hardiest of the outlaw's horses, which he had tracked down and retrieved. It was a raw-boned sorrel, as tough and resilient as the man who now led it. Isabel rode, while Kaelin walked his long, tireless strides, eating up the miles. The shared knowledge of their common enemy. Bartholomew Thorne had subtly shifted the dynamic between them. His silence was no longer a barrier, but a shared space of understanding. Glances and small gestures conveyed complex thoughts. A hand raised to halt a nod towards a track in the snow. A look of grim acknowledgement when she winced in pain. It was a language all their own. She felt a growing sense of urgency, a desperate need to find the federal marshal Patrick O'Connell and hand over the burden of her father's legacy. She had managed to retrieve the book from the wrecked Stagecoach on a quick, nerve-wracking detour before they set out. It was now safely tucked into Kaelin's saddlebags, a heavy secret between them. Blackwood Gulch appeared suddenly, a smudge of dark wood and grey smoke in a wide, snow-dusted valley. From a distance it looked like any other frontier town, a single main street, a collection of false-fronted buildings, a church steeple reaching for the leaden sky. For Isabel, it was a beacon of hope, the end of a horrific ordeal. It meant a proper doctor-warm food safety and justice. As they drew closer, however, a sense of unease began to prickle at her. The town was too quiet. There were no children playing in the street, no wagons rattling by. The few people they saw, a woman shaking a rug from a porch, a man leaning against a post, scurried away, or turned their faces as they approached their movements, furtive and fearful. An invisible pall of oppression hung over the town, as tangible as the wood smoke in the air. Kaelin felt it too. His body went rigid, his hand resting almost unconsciously on the hilt of the knife at his belt. His eyes, which had been focused on the trail ahead, now scanned the rooftops, the alleyways, the shadowed doorways. He was no longer a guide. He was a predator entering another's territory. They rode down the center of the main street. The sign on the largest building read, "Blackwood Mining and Provisions." But its windows were boarded up. The saloon doors were shut tight. The only place that showed any sign of life was the sheriff's office. "I need to find Marshal O'Connell," Isabel said, her voice low. "The sheriff should know where he is." Caelan gave a short, sharp shake of his head. He pointed with his chin towards the sheriff's office, then held up a hand, a clear sign to wait. He gestured for her to stay with the horse and melted into the narrow alleyway between the assayer's office and the silent saloon. He moved with a liquid grace that made him seem to disappear into the shadows. Isabel waited, her heart beginning to pound a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The hope that had buoyed her spirits was rapidly draining away, replaced by the familiar cold dread she'd felt during the ambush. Something was profoundly wrong with this place. A man emerged from the sheriff's office. He was a tall, rangy deputy with a drooping mustache and a cruel, thin-lipped mouth. He wore his gun belt slung low on his hips in the manner of a man who was proud of his weapon. He looked up and down the empty street, his eyes narrowing when they settled on Isabel, a lone, well-dressed woman on a weary horse. He started towards her, a swagger in his step. Just then Caelan reappeared at her side, as silently as he had vanished. He simply materialized from the shadows, his presence a solid, reassuring wall. The deputy's swagger faltered slightly when he saw Caelan. He took in the buckskins, the rifle, the hard, uncompromising stillness of the man. His hand drifted down towards the butt of his pistol. "Strangers ain't welcome here," the deputy said, his voice a low growl. He stopped a few feet away, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "State your business and move on." "I'm here to see Marshal Patrick O'Connell," Isabel stated, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have urgent federal business with him." The deputy's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite read. Amusement? Contempt? He exchanged a look with another man who had just stepped out of the sheriff's office. A heavier, older man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Augustus Cole. His face was florid, his eyes small and piggy. Marshal O'Connell. The sheriff chuckled a wet, unpleasant sound. Had a bit of an accident, the marshal did. Tragic. Fell from his horse a few weeks back, broke his neck. We buried him proper. Isabel felt the blood drain from her face. O'Connell was dead. The one man her father had trusted her entire reason for this perilous journey was gone. The foundation of her plan had crumbled to dust. Now the sheriff continued, his eyes crawling over her. As for federal business, we handle our own business here in Blackwood Gulch. The only law here is my law. So unless you've got a claim to stake, I suggest you and your friend water your horse and be on the next trail out of town. It was a dismissal, cold and final. But as the sheriff spoke, Isabel's eyes were drawn past him to a man standing in the shadowed doorway of the saloon across the street. A very large man in a thick buffalo coat. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, Bartholomew Thorne. He was watching them, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his bearded face. He knew exactly who she was. He had been waiting for her. O'Connell's accident was no accident. The trap had been laid weeks ago, and she had just walked straight into it. This wasn't just a town under an outlaw's thumb. It was his personal fiefdom. The sheriff, the deputy, they were his men. Caelan saw him too. His entire body became a coiled spring of lethal tension. His hand didn't move, but Isabel could feel the violence simmering just beneath his skin. His eyes locked with Thorne's across the dusty, snow-blown street. A silent declaration of war passed between them. The hunter had found his quarry, but the quarry was standing in the heart of his own fortress, surrounded by his army. The deputy, seeing the direction of their gaze and the sudden charged atmosphere, drew his pistol. "I said, get to moving," he snarled. Before Isabel could react, Kalen moved. It wasn't a dramatic, fast draw motion. It was a fluid, economical explosion of violence. He took one step forward, his left hand shooting out to grab the deputy's gun hand, twisting it viciously inward with a sickening crunch of bone. The deputy screamed as his pistol clattered to the ground. In the same motion, Kalen's right hand brought the butt of his own heavy hunting knife up in a brutal arc, slamming it into the side of the deputy's head. The man crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut unconscious before he hit the ground. It was over in less than 2 seconds. The sheriff stared, his mouth agape, his hand hovering uselessly over his own holstered weapon. Across the street, Thorne didn't move, but the smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a look of cold fury. 2 more of his men appeared at his side rifles in hand. Kalen ignored them all. He grabbed the reins of the sorrel, his eyes fixed on Isabel's. He gave a sharp, urgent jerk of his head towards the far end of town, the way they had come. "Go now!" There was no time to think, no time to argue. Gunshots rang out, splintering the wooden post next to Isabel's head. She ducked low over the horse's neck as Kalen gave the animal a powerful slap on the rump. The horse bolted, surging forward in a panicked gallop. Isabel clung on for dear life, glancing back for a horrifying second. Kalen was not following. He had kicked over a water trough, using it as cover as he coolly raised his plains rifle. He was staying behind. He was buying her time. He was drawing the fire facing down Thorne and his entire gang alone to give her a chance to escape. The last thing she saw before the horse careened around a corner was the flash of his rifle and a man on the saloon porch, staggering backward, clutching his chest. She was alone again, a fugitive in a town of wolves, with her only protector engaged in a battle he could not possibly win. The sanctuary of Blackwood Gulch had been a lie. It was a cage, and the door had just slammed shut. Panic was a wild animal in Isabel's throat. Her first instinct was to flee, but the image of Kalen's resolute face, already resigned to death as he stood against Thorne's gang, stopped her cold. To run would be to render his sacrifice meaningless. Be brave, Isabel. Be smart. Her father's words cut through the fear. Bravery without a plan was suicide. She wrenched the horse to a halt behind the town's abandoned livery stable, her mind racing. Thorne had the guns, but she had the truth. She slid from the horse and pulled the saddlebags off her hands, fumbling to retrieve meditations. With a small knife, she sliced open the false bottom, the crisp documents, a stark contrast to the dusty floor. Here was her weapon. Spreading the papers out, the full scope of the conspiracy became terrifyingly clear. The Blackwood Mining and Provisions Company was a front. Her father's notes detailed the original claim holders, men whose names were now listed as deceased or whereabouts unknown. Thorne, under Harrison Croft's direction, had systematically murdered them for a valley rich with silver. The townsfolk weren't just oppressed. They were living on stolen, blood-soaked ground. She needed an ally. The fearful faces she'd seen were too broken, but the church steeple offered a sliver of hope. Perhaps the pastor here had more steel than the timid reverend from the coach. Clutching the documents, she moved through back alleys, the sound of sporadic gunfire from the main street, a grim metronome counting down Kalen's final seconds. She found the pastor, Father Thomas, in the cold rectory, an old man with weary eyes. "They will kill him," Isabel said, her voice urgent, as she laid a map on his table. The man who saved me. They'll kill him unless we do something. Child, what can we do? Father Thomas whispered, defeated. Thorn owns this valley. To stand against him is to die. He doesn't own it. He stole it, she insisted, pushing her father's depositions forward. This was Jebediah Stone's claim. Thorn murdered him for it. And he had help. She unrolled the final damning page, a ledger showing payments from the railroad to Sheriff Cole. The sheriff is a paid executioner. Croft and Thorn are bleeding this valley dry while you live in fear. The old priest stared at the names of men he had known, men he had buried. A righteous anger long dormant ignited in his pale eyes. The church bell he rasped. We only ring it for fires or for a call to arms. Then ring it, Isabel urged. Tell them the truth. Give them a choice other than fear. As Father Thomas, his face set with new resolve, went to the bell tower, Isabel raced back towards the main street. The gunfire was more concentrated now, focused on the saloon. Just as she reached the edge of the street, the church bell began to toll a frantic, clamorous alarm that shattered the silence. People emerged from their homes, confused. Then Father Thomas's voice boomed out, telling the story of the stolen claims, the murders, the ledger. The effect was instant. Thorn's men, distracted from their siege, turned towards the commotion. The seed of rebellion had been planted. Miners with calloused hands looked at each other. Then at the boarded-up mining office, their expressions hardening. The lie they lived was unraveling. This was the chaos Kalen needed. Isabel saw a flicker of movement in a second-story saloon window. Kalen. He saw the unrest in the street and gave a sharp nod. He understood. A moment later, the saloon doors burst open and whiskey barrels came rolling out, a chaotic diversion. As all eyes followed them, Kalen dropped from a side balcony, landing silently in the alley's shadows. He had flanked them. Thorn, his face purple with rage, raised his rifle to shoot the priest. In that instant, Kalen stepped from the alley. He was no longer a tracker. He was an avenging angel. His rifle fired, and one of Thorn's men fell. He fired again, and another dropped. The townsmen, seeing their chance, surged forward with pickaxes and shovels. The street erupted. Thorn spun his eyes wide with shock. "You," he bellowed, raising his own rifle. Kalen dropped his empty rifle and drew his knife, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Thorn's shot went wide as Kalen lunged, crashing into him. They fell, a rolling, grunting mass of violence. Thorn was bigger, but Kalen was faster, fueled by 2 years of cold rage. He gained the upper hand, his knife flashing. Thorn shuddered and went still. Kalen rose slowly, his chest heaving, covered in blood. He looked down at the body of his nemesis, his expression not of triumph, but of vast, hollow emptiness. The hunt was over. Across the chaotic street, his eyes found Isabel's. They had done it. The town was free, its liberty paid for in blood. In the aftermath, the town of Blackwood Gulch breathed a fractured, fragile sigh of relief. Thorn's men were rounded up by the newly emboldened townsfolk, and Sheriff Cole was locked in his own cell. The church became an infirmary, where Isabel, with a steady competence that surprised even herself, tended to the wounded. The society woman she had been was a ghost replaced by someone forged in ice and fire. Kalen sat apart on a back pew, nursing a deep gash on his forearm. He stared at the tarnished silver locket in his hand, his face a mask of impenetrable grief. His war was over, but peace was a distant country. Isabel finished her work and sat near him, respecting the silence that had for so long been his only language. "What was her name?" she asked softly. He flinched but did not look up. When he finally answered, his voice was a low, rough rasp corroded by years of disuse. It was the first word she had ever heard him speak. Anya. The name was a wound. She was my wife. Thorn. He and his men came to our homestead for the railroad. They burned everything. He closed his eyes. "I carved this for her," he said, indicating the tiny wooden bird in the locket. "I have been hunting him for 2 years. You have justice now," Isabel offered quietly. "Justice is a cold comfort," he replied, his voice rough. "It doesn't fill the silence." They sat as dusk fell, 2 survivors adrift. Within a week, the spring thaw began, and a real federal marshal arrived from Helena. He took custody of the outlaws and began untangling the legal mess of the valley, using Isabel's documents to begin the long process of exposing Harrison Croft. Her father's mission was complete. Her own purpose here, however, felt unfinished. The thought of returning to Philadelphia was unthinkable. She found Kalen by the stables a few days later as he packed his saddlebags. He was preparing to leave. "Where will you go?" she asked. He looked to the northern mountains, his eyes distant. "Don't know. Never thought past finding him. Maybe I'll find a place where the silence is just quiet." A future stretched before him, as vast and empty as the ice flats he had carried her across. She looked at the recovering town, at the faces of people she had helped. "They've asked me to stay," she said, the idea solidifying as she spoke it. "The town council. They need a teacher." He turned, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. He studied her, seeing the resolve that had replaced her fear. "It's a hard life. I'm harder than I look," she replied with a faint smile. He finished his packing and stood before her, a man untethered. He reached out his calloused fingers, gently touching the place on her shoulder, where she'd been shot, a final acknowledgement of their shared journey. "Be safe." "Isabel," he said. The sound of her name in his quiet voice was the most profound thing he could have said. It was recognition, acceptance, and a release. He swung onto the sorrel horse, his gaze fixed on the northern trail. He did not look back. Isabel watched until he was a dark speck disappearing into the vast and unforgiving wilderness. She touched her shoulder, the faint ache a permanent reminder of the price of survival and the silent man who had paid it with her. In the end, vengeance is a lonely road, and survival is only the beginning of the journey. The man they called the Silent One found his justice but not his peace, vanishing back into the wilderness that understood his sorrow. And Isabelle Laurent, the woman left for dead, found not the end of her life, but the true beginning of it, not in the gilded cages of the East, but in the harsh, honest heart of the West. Their story is a reminder that our deepest scars often pave the way for our greatest strengths, and that sometimes the most important words are the ones spoken after a long, painful silence. If this journey across the ice flats moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of history. Thank you for listening.